Before you watch, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see will change the way you think about gangs forever. MS-13 wasn't always untouchable, and today we reveal the untold story of its rise, betrayal, and decline. Watch closely, comment your thoughts, and share this with anyone who needs to understand the true cost of fear and power. Stay until the end. You won't believe how a once-feared empire crumbled from the inside out. The story of MS-13, one of the most notorious gangs in the United States, is a tale of terror, loyalty, and inevitable decay. In the 1980s, El Salvador was engulfed in a brutal civil war, leaving countless children orphaned or displaced. Many fled to the United States, seeking safety in cities like Los Angeles. Among them, teenagers carried the trauma of violence, loss, and survival instincts honed in the midst of war. It was in these immigrant neighborhoods, isolated and neglected by both society and the law, that MS-13 first took root. The gang offered a sense of family, protection, and identity, but it came at a heavy price. Violence became a currency, fear a language, and loyalty was enforced by blood. During its early years in Los Angeles, MS-13 thrived on brutality. Their reputation grew as the gang systematically intimidated communities, extorted money, and engaged in turf wars with rival gangs. Stories from law enforcement and survivors recount gruesome acts designed to instill terror. The gang's power relied not just on weapons, but on a pervasive psychological grip over neighborhoods. Even the bravest residents knew better than to cross them. Schools, parks, and streets became zones of quiet obedience. To outsiders, MS-13 seemed unstoppable, a shadow empire built on fear. However, the seeds of decline were sown almost as soon as the gang rose. Its rapid expansion attracted attention from law enforcement at local, state, and federal levels. By the early 1990s, authorities had begun to recognize the pattern of violence, recruitment, and immigration entanglement that defined MS-13. Operation Cul-de-sac, among other initiatives, targeted gang members in Los Angeles, leading to mass arrests and deportations. Many of the most violent members were sent back to El Salvador, inadvertently exporting MS-13's structure and brutality overseas. The gang's influence spread internationally, but it also became fragmented. Leaders who once wielded absolute control over their cells now found themselves facing new rivals, both at home and abroad, and an ever-watchful legal system ready to exploit any misstep. Internal fractures emerged as the pressure of law enforcement combined with deportation policies to destabilize the organization. Loyalty, once the gang's strongest weapon, began to falter under scrutiny, fear, and personal ambition. Accounts from former members revealed that the camaraderie of earlier days had eroded into paranoia. Members who once acted as brothers in arms now questioned one another's motives. Betrayal became commonplace. Those who had survived countless fights in El Salvador now faced betrayal from friends they had trusted with their lives. These internal divisions weakened the gang's cohesion, making it less able to maintain its reign of terror and more susceptible to external attacks from rival groups and law enforcement. Moreover, MS-13's public image, once synonymous with omnipresent fear, began to show cracks. Media reports and police records began to expose the gang's brutality and the human cost behind its reputation. Families of victims spoke out. Community leaders organized grassroots resistance, and ordinary citizens no longer remained silent. Neighborhoods, once under MS-13's shadow, started to mobilize, creating informal networks of protection and reporting. The gang's grip on the public psyche weakened as the very communities it sought to dominate learned to push back, even in small ways. Fear, which had been MS-13's greatest weapon, no longer ensured total obedience. The gang had underestimated the resilience and courage of the people it terrorized. By the mid-1990s, MS-13 was at a turning point. Its rise to dominance had been fueled by fear, strategic brutality, and the exploitation of a vulnerable immigrant population. Its decline, however, was a consequence of overexposure, legal scrutiny, internal betrayal, and the awakening of the communities it once oppressed. The gang's empire, though still feared in pockets of Los Angeles and El Salvador, had lost the omnipotent aura that had made it legendary. Stories from law enforcement and survivors alike portray a gang that, despite its violent prowess, was struggling to adapt to new pressures and a rapidly changing landscape. The decline was not sudden, but marked by incremental failures, lost territories, fractured alliances, and a growing perception that MS-13, though still dangerous, was no longer untouchable. Yet, the human element of this story is what makes it so compelling. For every headline of murder, extortion, or arrest, there is a personal story of loss, fear, and survival. Communities affected by MS-13 have endured trauma that lingers for decades, while former members struggle with the consequences of choices made under duress, violence, and the illusion of power. The rise and decline of MS-13 is more than a tale of gang violence. It is a reflection of human resilience, the fragility of fear-based power, and the inevitability that no empire built solely on terror can endure forever. As the first cracks appeared in the gang's seemingly indomitable structure, the stage was set for further unraveling, a story of decadence that would only deepen in the years to come. By the mid-1990s, the once seemingly untouchable MS-13 had begun to feel the weight of the law closing in. Law enforcement agencies across the United States, from local police departments to the FBI, had begun to coordinate in ways that had never been done before. The gang's violent reputation had attracted not only public outrage, but also federal scrutiny. Investigators quickly realized that the MS-13's network was sprawling, with cells in Los Angeles, New York, and other major cities, each operating semi-independently, yet united by a shared code of fear and loyalty. What had once been an invisible menace now became a priority target for the authorities, and the wheels of justice began to turn with relentless precision. Operation Cul-de-sac, one of the earliest and most significant federal interventions, marked a turning point in the battle against MS-13. Using a combination of wiretaps, undercover agents, and community intelligence, law enforcement managed to infiltrate several key cells, documenting their criminal activities in meticulous detail. Raids were carried out simultaneously across multiple neighborhoods, catching gang members off guard and dismantling critical infrastructure. Weapons caches were seized, illegal operations shut down, and the arrest of influential leaders sent shockwaves through the organization. The gang, which had relied on fear and secrecy as its main shields, suddenly found itself exposed and vulnerable. The aura of invincibility that had protected its members for so long began to fade. Deportation policies added another layer of pressure. Many of the gang's most violent and strategic members, originally Salvadoran immigrants, were sent back to El Salvador. While this move exported the gang's operations internationally, it also created gaps in leadership that left remaining members disoriented and disorganized. New recruits, often younger and less experienced, were left to fill the void, but without guidance from seasoned leaders, they struggled to maintain control. These deportations, intended as a tactical advantage for law enforcement, inadvertently contributed to the fragmentation of the gang. The very mechanisms that once strengthened MS-13, tight-knit hierarchies, fear, and loyalty, were now being dismantled piece by piece. The impact of these crackdowns was profound on both the gang and the communities they had terrorized. Streets once dominated by MS-13 saw a temporary reprieve from violence, though the scars left behind were deep. Families who had lived in fear for years now had the courage to speak out, providing testimony and evidence that further strengthened federal cases. Community centers, schools, and local organizations became critical partners in the fight, creating support networks that both prevented new recruitment and encouraged young people to escape the cycle of violence. The once clear line between gang power and community resistance began to shift as the law's presence empowered those who had long been silenced. However, the story was far from over. The arrests and crackdowns exposed the gang's vulnerabilities, but also ignited a new kind of desperation within its ranks. With leaders behind bars or deported rival factions competed for control, escalating violence internally even as they attempted to maintain their grip on territories. Some cells turned increasingly brutal in an effort to assert dominance, committing acts of terror that, paradoxically, drew even greater law enforcement attention. The cycle of violence intensified temporarily, but the overarching trajectory was clear. MS-13's unchallenged power was eroding. Inside the gang, fear shifted from being a tool used against communities to a force driving internal instability. Members who once enforced rules without question now worried about betrayal, informants, and the ever-present risk of arrest. Allegiances became fragile, trust fractured, and paranoia spread like wildfire. Formerly cohesive units splintered into smaller groups, each trying to adapt to the new reality of constant surveillance and legal pursuit. Stories from former members paint a picture of confusion and disarray, of a gang grappling with the dual pressures of law enforcement and internal instability. The carefully constructed web of power and intimidation that had once seemed impervious was unraveling at astonishing speed. The long-term effects of these federal interventions cannot be overstated. MS-13's mythology of omnipotence was shattered, replaced by a growing perception of vulnerability and decay. While the gang would continue to operate in certain areas, its influence and ability to strike fear on a national scale had been significantly reduced. Communities began reclaiming spaces once considered off-limits, and local law enforcement gained confidence in pursuing cases that would have been impossible years earlier. The narrative had shifted. The gang that had thrived on terror was now facing the relentless might of coordinated law enforcement, a force that proved that even the most feared organizations are not beyond the reach of justice. This chapter in the story of MS-13 illustrates a fundamental truth about power built on fear. It is never invincible. The law, when strategically applied and combined with community support, can dismantle structures that seem impenetrable. For MS-13, the mid-1990s represented the beginning of a slow, painful decline, setting the stage for internal betrayals, lost territories, and a fading reputation. It was a turning point where the gang's dominance was no longer a given, and the consequences of unchecked violence became painfully apparent. The story of these federal crackdowns is not just a story of arrests and convictions. It is a story of resilience, the reclaiming of neighborhoods, and the realization that even the most feared empire is vulnerable to the law and the human spirit. As MS-13 faced increasing pressure from law enforcement in the mid-1990s, a different kind of threat began to emerge from within its own ranks. The gang that had once thrived on strict loyalty and ruthless unity began to fracture under the weight of arrests, deportations, and a shifting power landscape. The very bonds that had held members together, shared violence, survival instincts, and the promise of brotherhood, started to crumble as fear replaced trust. Former members recount stories of paranoia spreading like wildfire, whispers of betrayal in darkened alleyways, and the constant uncertainty of who could be trusted. What had been a cohesive, if brutal organization, was now a fragile network teetering on the edge of collapse. The internal strife was not limited to mistrust alone. Leadership vacuums created by deportations and arrests set off a series of brutal power struggles. Regional bosses and local enforcers vied for control, often resorting to extreme violence against their own comrades to assert dominance. In Los Angeles, for example, rival factions began targeting each other with the same brutality they had once reserved for rival gangs, executing public killings that sent a clear message of intent to both allies and enemies. These conflicts, fueled by ambition and desperation, revealed the dark side of MS-13's Brotherhood, a system that promised loyalty but delivered blood when ambition demanded it. The stories of former leaders testify to the chaos: plots to assassinate former allies, secret alliances formed in shadows, and sudden disappearances that were never explained. The betrayal was not only about power, but also about survival. Many members realized that the gang's new reality required them to make impossible choices: align with one faction and risk retaliation from another, or attempt to escape and face punishment for perceived disloyalty. The once clear hierarchy dissolved into a web of competing interests, where personal survival often outweighed collective loyalty. Even the most devoted members found themselves questioning the very rules that had once seemed absolute. Loyalty, once a sacred code enforced by fear, had become fluid, transactional, and dangerous. Stories from former members reveal the chilling psychology of the time: friends turning on friends, brothers in arms plotting in secret, and the constant tension of knowing that a single misstep could mean death. External pressures only magnified these internal conflicts. As law enforcement cracked down on the gang and deportations fragmented leadership, rival gangs seized the opportunity to expand into territories once controlled by MS-13. The resulting competition exacerbated internal divisions as factions argued over strategy, territory, and alliances. The violence became cyclical, with internal betrayals and external attacks feeding off each other in a pattern that no single member could fully control. Each act of internal violence weakened the gang's overall structure, leaving communities vulnerable to a chaotic mix of retaliation and opportunistic crime, but also signaling that MS-13's dominance was no longer absolute. One of the most striking aspects of this internal decay was the psychological toll on members. Those who had survived years of brutal initiation and violent campaigns now faced the unsettling reality that the greatest danger might come from within. Stories of former enforcers described sleepless nights, heightened paranoia, and a creeping sense of inevitability. The recognition that their empire of fear was beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. The Brotherhood that had promised security and identity now demanded constant vigilance, suspicion, and preemptive strikes against perceived traitors. In this environment, betrayal became both a survival tactic and a symptom of a larger organizational rot. As the 1990s progressed, these internal divisions had profound consequences for MS-13's operational capacity. Planning became more fragmented, coordinated attacks less frequent, and strategic decision-making weakened. The gangs once feared efficiency in managing territories, enforcing loyalty, and intimidating communities, began to deteriorate. Law enforcement, recognizing the value of exploiting these fractures, often relied on informants and defectors to dismantle cells more effectively. The very system of fear that had protected MS-13 now left it vulnerable. As trust eroded, so did the gang's ability to maintain cohesion, recruit effectively, and control its territories. Ultimately, the story of MS-13's internal betrayal is a tale of human fragility within a system built on terror. Power, loyalty, and fear are not immutable forces. They can corrode, crack, and collapse when tested by pressure, ambition, and external scrutiny. For MS-13, the combination of federal crackdowns, deportations, and personal ambition created a perfect storm. The result was a gang increasingly divided against itself, struggling to maintain a semblance of authority even as the myth of its invincibility began to crumble. This internal decay set the stage for the next chapter in the gang's story. The loss of territory, the rise of rivals, and the gradual fading of the reputation that had once made MS-13 synonymous with fear. The betrayal within MS-13 teaches a critical lesson about the fragility of organizations built solely on violence and fear. No matter how ruthless or disciplined, human ambition, paranoia, and survival instincts can disrupt even the most tightly controlled system. As the gang faced the consequences of its own internal rot, it became clear that the era of unquestioned dominance was over. What remained was a network of factions, mistrust and desperation, an empire in slow-motion collapse, haunted by the ghosts of its own making. The legacy of MS-13's internal divisions would echo not only through the lives of its members, but also across the communities it once terrorized, illustrating the inevitable decay of power sustained by fear alone. By the late 1990s, MS-13's internal turmoil and relentless law enforcement pressure had created openings that rival gangs were quick to exploit. Once, the mere mention of MS-13's name was enough to command obedience in neighborhoods across Los Angeles and beyond. Streets, parks, and housing projects were under the gang's iron grip, enforced by fear and brutal retaliation. But as arrests, deportations, and internal betrayals weakened the gang from within, the clear lines of dominance began to blur. Rival gangs, sensing opportunity, started encroaching on territories that had been considered untouchable. Local crews, emboldened by MS-13's faltering control, tested the gang's reputation with calculated aggression. The message was clear: the streets were no longer ruled by a single, omnipotent force. Communities themselves became pivotal in this struggle for control. Families and neighborhood leaders, long silenced by intimidation, began to push back. Grassroots initiatives, community patrols, and local advocacy groups emerged, determined to reclaim the spaces that MS-13 had dominated for years. Schools, churches, and civic organizations provided safe havens for youth, attempting to prevent recruitment and disrupt the gang's pipeline of new members. Residents started documenting criminal activity, providing information to law enforcement, and creating informal networks of resistance that made it harder for the gang to operate with impunity. For the first time in decades, fear no longer ensured total compliance. MS-13 had underestimated the resilience of the people it sought to control, and that miscalculation would cost the gang dearly. The loss of territory was not immediate, nor was it uniform across all regions. In some neighborhoods, MS-13 clung to control through sheer brutality, using violence to silence rivals and maintain appearances. But in other areas, the gang's influence waned rapidly as rival groups moved in with strategic precision. The competition for dominance led to escalating violence, often spilling over into public spaces and drawing further law enforcement scrutiny. Every incursion by a rival gang or organized community effort chipped away at the gang's credibility and aura of invincibility. What had once seemed like an unassailable empire was now vulnerable to both external challenges and internal decay. Accounts from former MS-13 members illustrate the psychological impact of this territorial loss. Where once their presence inspired fear, now they faced the possibility of ambush, betrayal, or community-led retaliation. The constant threat of attack forced the gang to spread its already thin resources across a larger area, weakening its ability to enforce loyalty or maintain cohesion. Members who had once felt secure within their territory now experienced vulnerability in every alley and corner. The streets that symbolized power and control became arenas of uncertainty, and the gang's mythic reputation began to erode in the eyes of both members and the public. Community resistance played a particularly significant role in reshaping the landscape. Activists, parents, and former victims of gang violence organized neighborhood watches, collaborated with police, and initiated programs for at-risk youth. These initiatives were not merely symbolic. They directly challenged the gang's ability to recruit, extort, and control territory. Local media coverage amplified these efforts, showing that organized communities could push back against even the most violent criminal organizations. MS-13's leaders, accustomed to ruling through terror, faced a reality in which fear was no longer absolute, a critical factor in the gang's decline. Rival gangs also benefited from MS-13's weakened state, often capitalizing on internal disputes and leadership vacuums to claim new territories. These incursions were marked by calculated violence and intimidation, similar to tactics MS-13 had perfected in its rise. However, rival groups did not always maintain long-term control, as some conflicts escalated into ongoing cycles of retaliation. Even so, the symbolic impact was profound. The streets were no longer under the uncontested dominion of MS-13. The gang that once seemed invincible was now forced to defend itself on multiple fronts, balancing threats from outside factions, law enforcement, and the very communities it had terrorized for years. Ultimately, the struggle over territory revealed the fragility of power built solely on fear. MS-13's decline was not just a consequence of arrests or deportations, but also the result of its inability to adapt to shifting dynamics in both the criminal world and the communities it sought to dominate. As rival gangs pushed forward and neighborhoods organized, the gang's once imposing empire shrank, leaving only pockets of influence scattered across cities. The loss of territory was not merely geographic, it was a symbolic blow to the gang's identity, a visible manifestation of its fading power. The story of MS-13 losing control of its territories is a story of both human resilience and organizational decay. Communities, when empowered, can reclaim spaces dominated by fear, and rival factions can exploit weaknesses in even the most brutal organizations. For MS-13, the late 1990s marked a turning point, a period in which the combination of internal divisions, external competition, and civic resistance transformed the streets from symbols of terror into contested battlegrounds. The gang's reputation, once absolute, was now vulnerable, and its hold on power began to slip. What had been a reign defined by fear was now a cautionary tale of how even the most feared criminal networks can lose their grip when challenged on multiple fronts. By the early 2000s, the once dreaded name of MS-13 no longer carried the same omnipotent weight it had in previous decades. Communities that had once trembled at the mere whisper of the gang's presence began to recognize cracks in its armor. The arrests, deportations, internal betrayals, and loss of territory had all taken their toll, and the gang's reputation, the very weapon it had wielded most effectively, was now showing signs of irreparable decay. Where fear had once spread like wildfire, now doubt and defiance were beginning to take root. Families, students, and local leaders who had once been silenced by intimidation now spoke openly about the terror they had endured, reclaiming narratives that had long been dominated by violence. MS-13's diminished reputation was not only a result of external pressures, but also of internal mismanagement and chaos. Leaders who had survived deportation and incarceration struggled to maintain cohesion among fragmented cells, many of which had splintered into rogue factions. Rival gangs capitalized on the confusion, asserting dominance in neighborhoods once thought untouchable. Acts of violence meant to assert control often backfired, drawing further law enforcement attention and eroding public perception of the gang's power. In the eyes of the public and even its own members, MS-13 was no longer a monolithic force. It was a fractured network struggling to maintain relevance. Stories from former members provide chilling insight into the psychological decline accompanying the loss of reputation. Those who had once felt invincible under the gang's banner now faced the terrifying realization that the fear they had inspired was fading. Friends and associates began questioning leadership decisions, alliances shifted, and paranoia became constant. For many, the realization that the gang's feared image was unraveling brought not relief, but a new kind of anxiety, one rooted in uncertainty and the fragility of their own survival. Members who had relied on intimidation as protection now confronted the reality that the streets no longer automatically deferred to their authority. The consequences of a ruined reputation extended beyond the gang itself. Communities previously paralyzed by terror found new agency. Neighborhoods organized, youth programs expanded, and local media began highlighting the courage of residents who refused to be silenced. Law enforcement, emboldened by community cooperation and the gang's visible vulnerabilities, increased targeted interventions. This shift altered the very social fabric that had allowed MS-13 to flourish for so long. Where fear had once dominated daily life, a combination of civic resilience and legal action began to reshape the dynamics of power. Even internationally, MS-13's aura was beginning to wane. In El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, the deported members who had exported the gang's operations faced increased scrutiny and competition. Rival gangs and community groups challenged MS-13's authority, exploiting the same internal chaos that had plagued cells in the United States. The mythology of invincibility, which had once crossed borders with ease, began to falter. The gang that had built an empire on terror now faced skepticism, defections, and the relentless reality that its influence was no longer guaranteed. The psychological effect on the broader criminal ecosystem was profound. MS-13 had long served as both a cautionary tale and a dominant force, dictating behavior and alliances within the underworld. With its reputation faltering, other gangs recalibrated their strategies, taking advantage of power vacuums and diminished fear. The gang's previous reputation as an unstoppable entity no longer deterred rivals or discouraged resistance. In many ways, the erosion of fear was more damaging than any arrest or territorial loss. It undermined the very foundation on which MS-13's power had been built. The faded fear also had a symbolic impact on MS-13 members themselves. Confidence, which had once been bolstered by the knowledge that the community feared them, waned under the weight of uncertainty and internal conflict. Recruitment slowed, loyalty became fragile, and the gang's cohesion weakened further. Stories of former members reveal a sense of disillusionment, a recognition that the life they had committed to, defined by power and terror, no longer guaranteed status, respect, or safety. The empire that had seemed eternal now faced the stark reality of impermanence, showing that no amount of brutality can preserve dominance indefinitely. Ultimately, the fading of fear and the ruin of MS-13's reputation signaled a critical stage in the gang's decline. The combination of law enforcement pressure, community resistance, internal betrayal, and territorial loss had chipped away at its authority, leaving a shadow of what had once been a terrifying empire. The story of MS-13's diminished reputation is a testament to the fragility of power built solely on fear, and a reminder that even the most feared organizations are vulnerable to the combined forces of justice, community resilience, and the relentless passage of time. It is in this context, the slow, painful erosion of reputation, that the final blows to MS-13's dominance would take shape, setting the stage for the last chapter in the gang's descent. By the mid-2000s, MS-13 had transformed from an empire of fear into a fractured, vulnerable organization. The once legendary gang, notorious for its brutality and influence across US cities and Central America, was facing the cumulative effects of internal betrayal, law enforcement crackdowns, territorial loss, and a ruined reputation. What had been a monolithic entity now existed in scattered pockets, with power concentrated in isolated cells, struggling to survive rather than dominate. The very characteristics that had once made MS-13 feared Its ruthlessness, secrecy, and cohesion had become liabilities in a world where external pressures and internal decay demanded adaptation the gang was unable to achieve. The final blow to MS-13's dominance was as much psychological as it was structural. Members who had survived decades of violence, incarceration, and deportation were now contending with a new reality. The myth of invincibility had evaporated. Fear no longer worked as a tool to control communities. Loyalty was fragile, and the constant threat of law enforcement intervention loomed larger than ever. In cities like Los Angeles, New York, and Washington, D.C., neighborhoods that had once been under the gang's iron grip were now actively resisting, reporting criminal activity, and organizing community protection. The landscape that had once facilitated MS-13's rise, a combination of neglect, fear, and opportunity, had been irrevocably altered, leaving the gang struggling to maintain relevance. Internationally, the impact was equally profound. In Central America, deported members attempted to recreate the networks they had built in the US, but they faced increased scrutiny from governments and competition from rival gangs. In El Salvador and Honduras, new criminal organizations, often more strategic and less erratic than MS-13, were asserting control over territories and resources. The gang's ability to coordinate operations across borders was severely weakened by internal conflicts, arrests, and surveillance, preventing it from regaining the dominance it had once held. The international expansion that had initially seemed a sign of invincibility had become a logistical nightmare, contributing to the slow unraveling of the gang's power. Within the gang, survival instincts had replaced ambition. Members were no longer motivated by the promise of control or influence, but by the simple need to avoid arrest or death. The internal hierarchy that had once dictated loyalty and behavior became fluid and unstable. Factions operated independently, often engaging in violent skirmishes with each other rather than focusing on external expansion or dominance. Former enforcers described a pervasive sense of insecurity, a recognition that trust had become a dangerous liability. The internal disintegration was not just a symptom of external pressure, but a reflection of the gang's inability to adapt to a world in which its traditional tools of fear and violence no longer guaranteed authority. Community action and law enforcement played decisive roles in this final stage of decline. Programs designed to rehabilitate youth, combined with proactive policing and federal task forces, systematically dismantled remaining cells. Leaders were arrested, witnesses came forward, and the gang's communication networks were disrupted. MS-13, which had once operated in the shadows with impunity, found itself exposed, vulnerable, and increasingly irrelevant. Neighborhoods that had once cowered under the threat of violence were now reclaiming their streets, and the cultural power the gang once wielded was crumbling alongside its operational capacity. Yet, even in this state of decay, the question of survival remained. MS-13, by its very nature, had proven resilient in the past. Its decentralized structure, while a vulnerability in some respects, allowed pockets of the gang to continue operating despite the collapse of leadership elsewhere. Some cells adapted by engaging in low-level criminal activity or hiding from law enforcement, surviving as shadows of their former selves. The gang's legacy of violence and notoriety continues to echo in both the United States and Central America, a testament to the difficulty of completely eradicating such organizations. Still, these remnants are vastly diminished in both influence and cohesion, and their capacity to inspire fear or control territory has been fundamentally compromised. The story of MS-13's decline is ultimately a story of the limits of power built solely on fear, violence, and loyalty enforced by intimidation. No matter how ruthless or disciplined, such organizations are vulnerable to a combination of external pressure, internal conflict, and the resilience of communities. The final blow is not a single event, but the accumulation of decades of resistance, law enforcement action, betrayal, and social change. The empire that once seemed eternal has been reduced to fragmented factions, struggling to survive rather than dominate. As we look at MS-13 today, the question of survival is less about the gang's ability to regain power and more about its capacity to adapt to a world in which fear no longer guarantees control. Its legacy remains in the scars left on communities, in the lives of former members, and in the lessons learned about the fragility of violent empires. The fall of MS-13 is a cautionary tale, a testament to the resilience of human societies against terror, and a reminder that even the most feared organizations are not immune to decay when challenged by both internal contradictions and external forces. The gang that once ruled through terror is now a shadow of its former self, a relic of a violent past, struggling to survive in a world that has learned to fight back.